So let's go ahead and start off talking about that definition. While talking to some industry experts recently, it seems to me that there isn't full agreement on how we define those two topics. Ranga, I would like to go ahead and start with you. Can you share with us your definition of real-world evidence and real-world data, and where you believe some folks in the industry might actually disagree on that definition, maybe where we do and don't agree, and why we have those differences?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. First of all, thanks to Clinical Leader for having me here on this panel. And one of the first things I have to profess is, compared to my colleagues on this call, I wouldn't consider myself to be an expert on RWD, RWE, the spectrum. However, from my perspective, real-world data, real-world evidence, is fundamentally my understanding of it was based upon the framework that was laid out in 2008 and the guidances in 2018 and 19. And so I know that, traditionally, real-world evidence is based upon a subset of analysis from the real-world data that can then be extrapolated into decision-making all the way from discovery to the clinical development. But one of the things that, at least between 2018-19 and now, even with the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were certain adjustments that we had to make in terms of our clinical development program, going to the patient and decentralizing some of the activities that were ongoing. And the data collection at that point, although it was from a clinical trial perspective, what we realized is there are opportunities for data collection outside the context of what can be collected within the clinical trial in support of our clinical trials, especially in the later stages of what we are planning to strategize for our phase 2 and 3s. And then the question became, when we started looking at what that data, where the data is coming from, even though it's all HIPAA compliant and it's all protected information, doesn't fall necessarily within or might not fall within the framework of what one would think of as real-world evidence because of the definition and the way it has been laid out in the framework. And so, and I'm coming from a context of the rare disease spectrum where, apart from the patient, the caregiver is a significant support for the patient in terms of the data generation. So, so there may be facets that are not considered to be traditional data sources. And, I'm sure we are going to be talking about it as this discussion progresses. But that's where I'm coming from in terms of thinking about real-world evidence as being a little more broader or maybe rethinking what goes into that segment. And my view is as we are evolving, it probably is not going to be exclusively a subset of where the real-world data exists.
Thank you for starting us off on that. And Christoph, I know that you guys are doing a lot of work in this area. I think the last time that you and I spoke, we delved into this area of real-world evidence and some of the things that you guys are doing. Anything additional that you would like to share in this regard, or anything that Ranga perhaps left out that you guys would include in that?
Sure. I think, first of all, let me stress again, and I agree with Ranga on that we can't define real-world evidence broad enough. Yeah. So data you collect in EMR to data that you collect on mobile devices right now in real time could be considered real-world data. Just to add another definition, obviously, for everyone to understand, real-world evidence is then the clinical evidence that we generate by analyzing real-world data. Yeah, so I think those are the two definitions we should work with. And it's important the FDA has defined real-world evidence as broad as possible. I want to highlight one more point here a little bit more in depth, and that is the fact that the FDA does actually consider controlled clinical trials, pragmatic controlled clinical trials, as real-world evidence as well. And as we will see probably during the conversation today, that's another important point as well as we talk talk about regulatory grade real-world evidence, where that can be a promising approach for the future to generate clinical evidence that then leads to the approval of medicinal products. Yeah. We, for example, at Otsuka, and I think that's something we have discussed in the past, are running a pragmatic controlled clinical trial right now where we investigate the effect that digital therapeutics have in the space of mental health. And that is an area where we're very excited to utilize these pragmatic approach in the way we approach the patient, as well as in the way we collect data in a real life-like setting. And we consider that a pragmatic trial.
Okay, thank you. And Gregg, any final thoughts or anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think they've done a marvelous job. You know, at Seqirus, and I think that most pharmaceutical companies, we have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. And now we've heard some of our panelists talk about how they're going to blur the lines, which I'm excited to hear more about. But typically a pivotal trial, our phase 3 trial, is a randomized clinical trial. We know how many people are a certain age. We know how many people are enrolled are male versus female. We know a lot about their demographics. And when we actually look at some real world data, and typically what we've been doing is looking at how people are utilizing their healthcare records. So we look at billing data, we look at electronic medical records, we look at laboratory data and hospitals. So there's a whole host of ways. And then now we can actually see how our vaccines compare in our clinical trials that are our pivotal phase 3 to how they work in the real world. So there's so many definitions and so many exciting things. I'm looking forward to the rest of the hour.